All 50 states are reopening ahead of the Memorial Day weekend. And Reggie, that comes as the death toll in the country approaches now 100,000. So every state has eased restrictions on some level, but the rules now vary state to state. Talk us through it.
Yeah, Farah, the rules do vary state to state. Look, we're just beyond the month point from when the Centers for Disease Control, in conjunction with the White House, had put out some gated criteria that states had to follow in order to get through a phased reopening. And very few of the states actually met any of the criteria that were listed in that three-part plan that was unveiled. And here we are now kind of in a similar situation. It was patchwork when these economies started to close, and it is now piecemeal as these economies start to reopen. Some states are doing it in a much more measured approach, like in New York State and California, Washington State, each of them kind of taking a very slow step to try and get back to some sense of normalcy. In New York State, upstate New York, western New York, they're allowing for very few businesses to reopen. New York City, though, is going to remain closed simply because it remains such an epicenter. But it's a stark difference when you go to different states like Indiana. It's a Republican state. They're not using some of the criteria that were listed from the CDC. And then if you break it down further, in Indianapolis, they are using that CDC guideline. So it's mixed messaging causing the confusion from state to state. Texas saw its highest infection rate over the weekend with 2,700 cases. This as the state goes full-fledged on trying to get things reopened. And the state's attorney general is now kind of chastising these Democratic-held big cities for not following what the state is doing. It's really causing a bit of a problem. It's also causing problems because we're hearing reports that places like Georgia and Florida might be fudging the numbers that they're putting on their state websites, and that is causing problems when it comes to transparency, as people don't actually know what the case numbers are in the states that are actually trying to fully reopen.
I'm looking at the video that we're showing while you're speaking, and it's such a different picture here. I mean, beaches that are full. And one of the reasons behind the reopening, according to the president, is the economy, obviously restarting the economy. Everyone's trying to find that balance around the world. But some are saying now America's unemployment rate could reach 25%, Reggie?
Yeah, the Federal Reserve Chair was speaking over the weekend on 60 Minutes and said that there is a real possibility that, given the fact that we're at 15% unemployment right now, we are going to get further numbers later on this week and in the weeks to come that show just exactly what the employment situation has been over the last month or so. And there is a fear that that unemployment rate could tick up to 25% and possibly not get down to the 8 or 9% range until the end of next year. And this really has sparked a big conversation as to what needs to be done to bring the U.S. economy back to possibly not where it was at the beginning of this pandemic, but somewhere better than where it is right now. There are two different versions on how to go forth with that. The Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, was testifying on Capitol Hill yesterday, and he is echoing how the president is talking that the only way to get everything back to where it should be is businesses need to reopen, to let the money kind of flow back into those local coffers that can then be spread around. But the Federal Reserve Chair is calling on Congress to do more spending by saying, look, these stimulus packages that keep being passed, they're doing what they need to do. They're giving people money. They're allowing that money to be spent, and therefore that's generating and creating revenues for these local economies. But the president has already said the recent bill that was passed in the House a couple of days ago, another multi-trillion-dollar package, is essentially dead on arrival when it heads to the Senate. And if it does pass the Senate, he says that he will veto it because he says Democrats are going too far. They're trying to put too many goodies in their bag in this attempt to stimulate the economy. So when you're seeing these jobless numbers at 25% unemployment rate as a potential, and you have two different versions coming on how to fix that economy, it, along with this kind of mixed messaging on how to reopen, is really what's causing a lot of the confusion.
Reggie, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel through all of this is a vaccine. I mean, who knows if we're going to get one and how far we are from actually getting one. But the other part is contact tracing. Now, that's clearly very important when it comes to the caseload and seeing who has COVID-19. Regardless of where you live, what does contact tracing look like in the United States right now?
Nearly non-existent. Remember, like we were talking about earlier, this gated criteria that came out from the CDC, contact tracing was an integral part of that plan to try and get your economy back to where it once was. But it simply isn't happening for a number of different reasons, up to and including the fact that there simply isn't enough funding coming from the federal government to the states to be able to carry out this contact tracing, to be able to say, this is where the virus is, this is where it needs to be isolated, and this is how we can stem that. And state government governments are saying they don't have the equipment, nor do they have the resources or the personnel to carry out contact tracing. Experts have said kind of at a best case scenario, you need roughly 30 people doing contact tracing per 100,000 members of the population. And right now there are only 7 states plus the District of Columbia that actually have the staffing in place to carry this kind of contact trace testing out. And this kind of goes part and parcel with that growing problem across the U.S. where there simply aren't enough resources to carry testing out from coast to coast. So it's hard enough right now to tell who may be carrying the disease. It's even harder now to say who's potentially been infected by somebody that wasn't tested properly that's carrying the disease. And it all kind of intertwines with that fact that states are starting to reopen. It's hard to tell who's been sickened and who is passing this virus around. And with more people kind of coming into close contact with each other across these states that are just going gung-ho on trying to reopen, without that contact tracing in place, it really is going to cause problems. And this is really what health experts have been fearing now for weeks.
Certainly. Okay, Reggie Cecchini in Washington, thanks for your coverage and for joining us today.